no video, but he will talk to us for perhaps the first 10 or so minutes, and thereafter it will be an open discussion. My good man, Fanie Presention, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Jerry. Good morning, colleagues. Morning, delegates. It's a pleasure to be with you to discuss how procurement has responded during this pandemic, during this disaster period. You would note that on the 15th of March, that's when the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, announced and declared that the state is in a state of disaster as a result of these COVID-19 outbreak, and that the state needed to respond appropriately in order to minimize the impact of this disaster. You would also note that on the 18th of March, regulations under the Disaster Management Act of 2002 were issued, which wanted to minimize exactly the effects of the disaster. And those regulations were gazetted on the 18th of March. In the gazetted regulations, there were stipulations made that procurement needed to happen in accordance with PFMA, or your Public Finance Management Act of 1999, as well as in terms of Municipal Finance Management Act of 2003, which basically are the acts that guides us as public sector, as government, with regards to how procurement needs to happen. When that happened, I think as government, we had processes and systems that were generated that were guiding procurement of goods and services within a public sector. However, as the days progressed, what was very evident for us was that there were challenges that we were experiencing, and those challenges needed to be mitigated. The disaster actually indicated to us that it's no longer business as usual. Government departments and municipalities and provinces could not procure goods, specifically the PPE geared for fighting the disaster, could not be procured as it was normally procured. There are a number of things that posed challenges, if I may. We had the primary activities that we looked at and the supporting activities that we looked at that brought about a number of instruction notes that the public sector has experienced. We issued 2 instruction notes responding to what needed to be done in the public sector. The primary activities looked at our inbound logistics. Our inbound logistics were issues such as how are we going to procure as government now, because we're no longer going to have the muscles that we always have from suppliers. Our inbound logistics looked at how do we place orders, how do we receive these orders, and how do we do the storage of these orders and distribution of these orders, and how do we then make sure that our supply relationships are key factors in creating a value for government and creating value for the recipients of government services. And we experienced quite a number of challenges in that space because our traditional suppliers could only manage to provide to us the quantities that we requested. The moment when we started requesting a large number of quantities, it became a problem. Majority of the suppliers did not have the financial muscles to go in and manufacture or to buy from the primary sources in large quantities. That created a lot of bottlenecks in our inbound logistic facilities. That resulted in operations of government being hampered. We had to wait quite a number of times waiting for suppliers to deliver. We had to follow up on suppliers and make sure that the suppliers would deliver. We had promises that it will be with you tomorrow, and then the next thing, it's not with us tomorrow, it's with us the following day. New lead times were suggested. Quite a number of challenges were posed by outbound logistics were also quite a challenge. We just did not have capabilities, and we did not build capabilities in our current procurement legislative with regards to collection of goods that we've ordered. Remember that we have had huge consignment of stock that had to be procured overseas. The small suppliers were unable to fill up the cargo, to air freight the commodities into the country. And if we opted for sea, it would have taken us quite a long time. But we are sitting with a pandemic that requires PPE for it to be combated. So there was quite issues with regards to that. Our storage facilities, inadequate, not appropriate, posing quite huge challenges for government. We had not anticipated that we would have to have facilities that would cater for massive amount of goods that come into the country that we need to put in our storage environment for our consumption. If I may make an example, the SAPS, they are always on the road. How then do we make sure that in their vehicles, how do we make sure that stock is available on time and without impacting on the operations that they're carrying out on the roads and in the normal routine routes that they're doing over and above what is expected of them during the lockdown period. That was the main challenges with regards to our primary activities. And the other thing was the suppliers, the marketing of their products and the marketing of their services became a problem because we were inundated with suppliers that were not suppliers of the PPE prior to the pandemic, now making themselves visible and available to provide those commodities to us. Sometimes we in most cases, we did not know whether they are providing quality service. We did not know whether the products that they were offering to us would actually be appropriate and fit for service. So we were quite challenged with the issues with suppliers and with suppliers also wanting to go overseas to go and get these commodities and not making them available when we need them the most. The other challenge was the capability within the country was a challenge. The manufacturers of these PPE were producing only enough, and they were geared up for just enough to sustain the day-to-day functioning of government, the day-to-day functioning of other private sectors. Now, when the pandemic hit us, they had to gear up their operations in order to produce the quantities that we require, and that was not adequate enough to service the need that arose as a result of this pandemic. We have seen on the supplier side a drop in service, which necessitated that we needed to respond appropriately as government to ensure that that service is geared up. And I will touch to that a little bit later. The supporting activities that also posed challenges to us as government was the infrastructure. I've spoken about the warehousing facilities. I've spoken about the logistics facilities. Technology was also an enabler that didn't really predominantly become evident in our response, and it wasn't something that we were strong on. Municipalities use different technologies, departments use different technology, and the provinces use different technology. So our own ICT infrastructure was inadequate for us to respond appropriately as government. The human resources management, you would note that Mr. Porter spoke about the IT and the use of IT. You've had Mr. Mlambo spoke about the human resource management and how SCM's positioning is critically important. We found ourselves in a situation where we have not actually trained our SCM functionaries in the organs of state to respond appropriately to the disaster. So in our quest to ensuring that in the future we have an adequate response from a human resource perspective, we need to have a dedicated training or intervention that will assist us with this. Because that was one of the issues where we just did not know how to respond within an SCM environment, and how to utilize the technology that is available, at least in our own pockets of competencies, to respond to this. Our procurement as a total needed to have a new regime, hence new regulations were made available and were promulgated to ensure that everybody has a common understanding of what we needed to do as a government. Some of the things that I can trigger your minds with regards to best practices that we looked at. We looked at strategic sourcing. Strategic sourcing would give you indications about making sure that you leverage on bulk procurement and you make a decision to have a centralized environment so that you have multiple streams and multiple feeds into one environment. In this instance, we as a government, we said maybe we need to look at making sure that we have one implementing agent that would look at multiple streams and make all other suppliers to feed their product offerings into this central environment, and then that central environment will deal with all our outbound logistics management issues. The challenge at that time, it seemed like it was a good idea. The challenge with that was our IT environment did not enhance us to have an uptake, a quick uptake of offerings from small suppliers so that they can have all their commodities given to us from a central point of view, so that they can go and procure more commodities and have multiple feeds at given times, so that all the suppliers that we have in the supply pool that are competent, that are offering at the prices that we set, can be in a position to continuously provide us with goods and services. We have had multiple negotiations that happens with suppliers. We then decided that we will have one price determination within government, where we would determine what prices should be, and that every organ of state would buy from those prices. That had enabled us to have a sight of spend with regards to COVID-19, and also be in a position to clearly define which commodities are COVID-19 specific commodities and at what price we're intending to have them. And everybody was aware, including the suppliers in the value chain, that government would procure these and at these prices. Risk management was a bit of a challenge, because like I have indicated earlier, the quality of the goods that we're receiving was a challenge to us. Securing supply was a challenge to us. Continuity of supply was a challenge to us. Some of the risks that we had, like when we have consignments that come from overseas, our collaboration with SARS to ensure that the custom clearance happens on time, those we put in place to ensure that any consignment that come through our ports, that our port authorities assist us with making sure that COVID-19 specific commodities are not put in quarantines, but they are cleared quickly so that they are made available to come and fight the disaster that we are experiencing at the moment. Partnership with suppliers was critically important. Not only our implementing agent at that time, when we had that legislation running, was critical to discuss with that, but management of other suppliers and making sure sound relationships still exist, like for instance with our transversal suppliers that play traditionally in that space for those commodities, was critically important. And making sure that any other supplier that makes visible their stock to us, that we manage them and we make sure that we include them in the program was critically important for us to do that. We had issues of contracts management. Issues of contracts management was, now that we are hit by a disaster, how do we manage our current relationship with suppliers? It was quite encouraging and soothing when the transversal suppliers that we have current relationships with managed to come on board and managed to become part of the solution by agreeing to relax some of the clauses that we had in the contracts and making sure that they all become part of one regime, and one regime that follows one set of regulations to be able to manage this pandemic with us. Cost was a critical thing that we always had to guard against. Corruption happens every time when there's a disaster, and we managed to ensure that we regulate the prices, and we also managed to make sure that no one procures what they do not need. For an example, we had surgical masks clearly designated for health services to make sure that health services have the masks, and everybody else was defaulted to other areas. So those are the things that we looked at, and there's been quite a number of lessons that we've learned out of this situation. For an example, we need to look at are our current structures optimum? Is our current legislation optimum? In fact, this disaster has tested our thinking with regards to our new public procurement bill. We need to build issues of disaster in that bill. We need to make sure that we have an activation of appropriate sections of the bill, and regulations are lined up appropriately for procurement during disasters. That's one of the things that we looked at. Maybe I should just look at some of the things that were learnings from me, for my unit specifically as a transversal unit, which procures in bulk for government, was to evaluate our procurement processes. Are our current processes adequate? Besides the fact that we're reviewing the bill, the current processes that we're embarking on in procurement of these goods and services, are they adequate, or should they be reviewed? In fact, there are areas that we have identified that we need to look at. How do we automate our processes? I've alluded to technology. Technology was a challenge. I may have to indicate now that government is looking at making sure that we have integrated system in terms of IFMS, integrated financial management systems. How do we speed up that process to make sure that procurement is enabled through that integrated process? Enhancement of reporting. Huge challenge that will hit government at the moment is reporting. How do we then report? How do we then make sure that reporting is adequate? Issues of training I've alluded to. How do we train people to respond to emergencies? Or how do we train people to respond to extraordinary procurement measures? And how do we then ensure that suppliers or the supply base is trained to understand these things? We are inundated with emails where people do not even understand a basic tendering process or basic quotation process. And that hampers the way that we want to have suppliers as stakeholders in the value chain. Vendor management relationship, we've got CSD where suppliers register over and over again, but the quality and how those suppliers know how to take up opportunities under normal circumstances and during emergencies is going to become a challenge for us moving forward. And that's basically the intro that I wanted to just bring into the mix, and just spark a bit of your thoughts. We are currently reviewing the instruction that we issued. We had intentions to empower small suppliers. Inadvertent, as a result, we have had exclusion of the bigger ones, and the bigger ones are trying to, and we're trying to make sure that our response strategy makes sure that bigger and smaller and medium suppliers are taken care of in the value chain. You can remember that the impact of the pandemic is that majority of the big suppliers, as well as those who are individual and small suppliers, are hit hard, and we're trying to make sure that everybody adds value to the value chain and that everybody has a positive impact from supplying as a value chain. Mr. Jerry, that's my take for now. I think maybe we can start the discussions and see how we can best respond to the questions that are posed.
Thank you, Mr. Molefe. Really appreciate it. I think that we just wanted to go straight into one question from Ivanson Jomo. His question, he wanted to find out, is bulk procurement a possibility at this juncture, since corporates are actually cutting down on maverick spending? So is there a way for bulk procurement to happen?
Look, demand management is critically important now in this era. You cannot buy what you do not need. I think the model that we have we are looking at is just in time, your JIT model, where you have to project what your demands are going to be. Let me take an example, SAPS. They know the number of forces the number of personnel that are on duty at a given shift. They know the shift cycles, and they know in a month how many would be required to be. And they can make a contingency and say, we will need about 5% more, depending on maybe one of the mask could be defective, or they could have one or two officials on duty. So the just-in-time model seems to be the only model we could use now. However, if we are going to operate on just-in-time model, we need to make sure that the manufacturers would be in a position to have stock available in the country for us to draw from. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've got with the small suppliers is that they wanted to supply, but they could not fit in the just-in-time model because they had to wait for a longer lead time. And the pandemic requires that you respond now, and the number of quantities that we've got, we could at any given time tell what the demand is. But we needed to have warehousing facilities in the country by the suppliers so that those suppliers are in the position to respond to us. Remember, we've got challenges if you have to buy in bulk with regards to shrinkage. We do not want to experience loss in government because of shrinkage, and we did not want to experience loss because we did not have enough risk mitigating responses in government. So that's why it was critically important for us to get demands from all the departments and make sure that the procurement matches the demand, and that we also look at all other factors in government. For an example, there's no need for us to buy lots of quantities for hospitals when the bed occupancy is less. You need to buy in accordance to your bed occupancy. We need to buy in line with what the strategy of that procuring department is. But bulk procurement, if there is no just-in-time preparedness, would not have worked.